In this video, we're going to talk about square roots. And we're going to talk about square roots probably in a slightly different way than you're used to. All right, but I really want you to kind of stretch your mind a bit and really pay attention to the definition that we're going to be using, because this definition is going to help us with some more complicated things with square roots a little bit later. Here's the definition I want us to think about. So how do we define what a square root is? Right? How would we define what something like this is, the square root of n? Here's how we can define it. The square root of n is a number such that the square root of n times the square root of n will equal n. So whatever the square root of n is, if you multiply it times itself, you get n. All right, let's kind of use an example to make this a little bit more concrete. Suppose I ask you, what's the square root of 9? Now I know you already know the answer, but I want us to think about this definition. What's the square root of 9? Well, according to this definition here, whatever the square root of 9 is, if I multiply the square root of 9 times the square root of 9, I need to get to 9. So whatever the square root of 9 is, if I multiply it times itself, has to be 9. So what number, if I multiply it times itself, gets me 9? Now you all know the answer is 3. Right? So square root of 9, that's just 3. But again, I want us to really focus on this idea here. Let's look at one other real simple example before we look at something a little bit more complicated. What's the square root of 25? Right? Again, you probably know the answer, but I want us to remember what this definition tells us. Well, whatever the square root of 25 is, if I multiply the square root of 25 times the square root of 25, that better get me 25. Right? So we have to think, what number, if I multiply it times itself, would get me 25? Obviously, the answer is 5, because 5 times 5 is 25. Okay? This right here is the most important thing to think about. Square root of 25 times the square root of 25 has to be 25. That's why the square root of 25 is 5. All right, so let's think about this one. What's the square root of 41? Right? Now, this is not going to come out to be, a nice answer like the ones before, because 41 is not a perfect square. And in fact, if you use your calculator, you can get an approximation for what this is. The square root of 41 is approximately, if you use your calculator, you get 6.403, and this decimal, goes on forever. But I want us to think about, why does this make sense? Why is the square root of 41 approximately 6.403? Right? Well, the first thing, if we think about what this definition says, whatever the square root of 41 is, if you take that number and you multiply it times itself, you better get 41. Right? So we can kind of check this. Does this make sense? Is the square root of 41 approximately 6.403? And I know that number goes on forever, right? But what I'm saying is, the square root of 41, whatever that number is, if I multiply it, again, times itself, I need to get 41. So we can check the calculator, and let's see if 6.403, if I multiply that times, if I multiply 6.403 times itself, do I get 41? Right? And if you use your calculator to do 6.4031 times 6.4031, right, you get really close to 41. Right? It's like 40.999 something. Right? And again, the reason why it's not precise is because this number actually is a decimal that goes on forever. Right? But again, I want you to understand, why is the square root of 41 equal to this? Because this, if you multiply it times itself, you get 41. All right, so now that we have that definition, I want us to think about some multiplication problems with these square roots. What is the square root of 7 times the square root of 7 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 3? Right? And we're not going to write these answers with decimals. We're going to try to leave this in square root form or radical form. But thinking about the definition of what a square root is helps us to answer this. Right? Let's think about this. Do we know what the square root of 7 is? Right? It's some decimal. I don't know what it is. But what I do know is that the square root of 7, by definition, the square root of 7 times the square root of 7 has to be 7. So right away I know that the square root of 7 times square root of 7 is 7. Right? And then square root of 2 times square root of 3, this, we can just use this simple fact. Square root of 2 times square root of 3, that's just the same thing as the square root of 6. So then square root of 7 times square root of 7 times square root of 2 times square root of 3 is just 7 times the square root of 6. And we write that this way, 7 radical 6. I'm going to do one more and then you're going to look at some. So if I had this, the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 3 times the square root of 3, what would this equal? Right? Well, I don't know what the square root of 5 is, right, without a calculator. But what I do know is that by definition, the square root of 5, that's whatever number, if I multiply it times itself, gets me 5. Same thing with the square root of 3. What's the definition of the square root of 3? It's whatever number works such that the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 gets me 3. So what I'm saying is square root of 5 times square root of 5, that's just 5. And then square root of 3 times square root of 3, that's just 3. So this here is the same thing as 5 times 3, which is 15. I want you to use that same reasoning and see if you can multiply these out. Go ahead and pause and do this, and then we will take a look at the answer. All right, let's check, see what you did here. Right? Well, I know that the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 by definition is 3. Square root of 2 times the square root of 2 by definition is 2. So I have 3 times 2 times the square root of 5. That could be simplified as 6 times the square root of 5. Number 7, square root of 5 times the square root of 5 times square root of 5 times square root of 7 times square root of 7. Right? Well, by definition, the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5. The square root of 7 times the square root of 7 is 7. So what I have is 5 times the square root of 5 times 7. Right? And we can rearrange this to be 5 times 7 times the square root of 5, or in other words, 35 times the square root of 5. That's our answer. All right, so we're going to look at one more thing here. Let's think about this. So suppose Andrew says the square root of 75 is equal to 5 radical 3. Right? Well, you might remember how to simplify something like this into something like this. But let's think about what the definition of the square root says and if this makes sense. Okay, so Andrew says the square root of 75 is equal to 5 radical 3. Does that make sense? Right? Let's check using the definition of what a square root is. Right? Well, according to what the definition of a square root says, whatever the square root of 75 is, whatever that is, if I multiply that times itself, I should get 75. So if this is true, square root of 75 is 5 radical 3, then 5 radical 3 times 5 radical 3 better be equal to 75. Go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to see if you believe this. Do you think this is true or not? Okay, take a little bit of time and think about that. And then unpause and we'll talk about it. Turns out that Andrew is right. This is true, right? Because I could rearrange this like this. 5 times 5 times the square root of 3 times the square root of 3. And let's see if that's equal to 75. Right? Well, 5 times 5, that's easy. That's 25. Well, what's the square root of 3 times the square root of 3? Well, remember, by definition, the square root of 3 times the square root of 3, that's equal to 3. So we have 25 times 3, and that turns out is 75. Right? So Andrew is right in saying that the square root of 75 is 5 radical 3.